This is Module 1, Dynamics of Domestic Violence and Lethality Factors. I'm Joan Priddy, attorney and executive director of Project SAFE, the Domestic Violence Center in Athens, Georgia. Have you heard the story of the blind men and the elephant? It originated in India. And in the story, a group of blind men are gathered around an elephant, and each one is asked to describe what is in front of him. And so the guy that is standing in back by the tail is feeling up and down the tail and says, well, this is a whip. And the guys who are standing around the legs say, well, these are pillars. The guy standing by the ear feels the ear and says, this is a fan. And the story illustrates the relativity of truth. Each of the blind men is describing what he is feeling, what he is experiencing, but it is not an accurate description, of course, of the entire elephant. And the story is really applicable to a conversation about domestic violence because people who experience domestic violence in different systems see and hear and experience different things. So advocates that answer crisis hotlines and work in emergency shelters often hear the most harrowing stories of torture and abuse, whereas police frequently are called out for so-called domestic disputes, things that seem mutually combative and even minor. And so when we come together in our communities to try to address domestic violence, often we are talking about different things altogether. In fact, people who are just learning about domestic violence are often surprised when they realize there is no universally accepted definition of domestic violence. Advocates like myself, social service providers, generally take a broad view that emphasizes a pattern of abusive behavior, including intimidation and coercive control. In contrast, researchers usually focus on specific forms of violence, like physical abuse. And our statutory definition also focuses on discrete acts of abuse: simple battery, simple assault, criminal trespass, criminal damage to property, and so forth. In its broadest sense, we can define domestic violence like this: the use of illegitimate physical force and or control tactics within a relationship that is cohabitating or familial or intimate. And so by saying illegitimate, I'm suggesting that there are legitimate forms of physical force or control. And by that I'm referring to things like self-defense or defense of others, spanking children, or grounding or restricting teenagers. But within that broad definition of domestic violence, there is still a great deal of room for variance. And how we specifically define domestic violence influences our understanding of everything, from what causes it, to how often it occurs, to who is doing it, and what we need to do to try to stop it. And in fact, the variety of definitions and the resulting research has led to ongoing confusion and debate throughout our movement to end domestic violence. And here's an example of that. When domestic violence is characterized as criminal behavior or a threat to safety, research says that the perpetrators are overwhelmingly male. The so-called crime victimization studies use this characterization, and these studies show a pattern of serious violence that escalates. In contrast, if we define domestic violence narrowly, as a discrete act of physical abuse, a slap, a punch, a shove, studies show that the violence is much more bidirectional, that it's gender balanced, that is, that women are engaging in domestic violence as often as men. These are the so-called family conflict studies. And they show violence that is much more widespread, but much less severe, and with very little control at issue. In addition to the variety of research in terms of what constitutes domestic violence, we also have a variety of research that shows that the perpetrators of domestic violence are not a homogeneous group, that there are different types or categories of perpetrators. When we're talking about male batterers, we generally can put them into three different groups. And the first is called the family-only group, and this is about 50% of batterers. These guys exhibit the lowest levels of emotional or psychological abuse, and they're the least violent outside the home. And the second group is what's called the dysphoric or borderline batterers. This is about 25% of perpetrators. These guys are moderately violent, still mostly toward their partner. And they have higher levels of psychological distress, and they're more likely to exhibit borderline personality disorder. And then the last group, the remaining 25%, is what's called the generally violent or antisocial batterer. These are the most violent, with high levels of violence both inside the home and outside the home, and most likely to exhibit antisocial personality disorder. We have fewer female batterers than male batterers, but the emerging literature suggests that we can probably classify women into these same three groups as we classify men. So just as we have much research and competing theories about what is domestic violence and who is engaging in it, we also have multiple theories that have emerged over the last several decades about what causes domestic violence. Social learning theory says that domestic violence is caused by behavior that's witnessed in childhood. Conflict theory suggests that in family groups, conflict is inevitable, and sometimes that conflict may percolate into violent conflict. Feminist theory describes how patriarchy supports men's efforts to control their female partners. And attachment theory focuses on the strength of the attachment bond that's developed in infancy. And all of these theories are useful in helping us understand domestic violence, but they are incomplete. The theories are also evolving as newer research comes out. One example of that is how we're finding high incidence of personality disorder among batterers, particularly among chronic or repeat offenders. Now, decades ago, theorists used to characterize domestic violence as being a mental illness. That is, someone must be sick in order to do something like this. And those theories have largely been discredited, that domestic violence is a chosen behavior. But research is finding high incidence of the so-called cluster B disorders, things like antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, those sorts of things among these repeat offenders. And it's significant because people who have that are not going to respond to interventions such as family violence intervention programs. They're simply not going to make meaningful and lasting behavioral changes. And so it suggests that our interventions really need to be tailored, that we need to find new ways of responding to the variety of perpetrators, the variety of forms of domestic violence that we have. Because still, after all of these years and decades of working to end domestic violence, it is still the leading cause of injury to women in the United States. Some researchers believe that there are different kinds of domestic violence, And this certainly rings true to me. Do you remember Leo Tolstoy's book, Anna Karenina, has one of the best opening lines, I think, in all of Western literature. All happy families are just alike, but unhappy families are each unhappy in their own way. I think the most helpful distinction among types of domestic violence is between what we call battering or systemic abuse and what we call episodic or situational violence. And Michael Johnson is a researcher who has developed typologies of domestic violence based on the context and motive of the perpetrator. And going back all the way to when I was practicing law and doing post-conviction relief and doing clemency petitions for battered women in prison and all the way through my work with Project SAFE, I think Johnson's typologies are the most useful in providing a framework for understanding domestic violence. And so he identifies 4 different types of domestic violence: situational couple violence and intimate terrorism. And then within intimate terrorism, and subtypes of violent resistance and mutual violent control. And I'll just describe those last 2 briefly because we won't go into them very, very much here today. But violent resistance would be when the primary victim in an intimate terrorism dynamic engages in violence back at the perpetrator. It's not the same as self-defense because the victim may not necessarily be under attack at the time that she engages in the violence. Mutual violent control occurs when 2 intimate terrorists get together. As you can imagine, this probably doesn't happen all that often because when one person is desirous of totally dominating and controlling his or her partner, they're probably not going to get past the first dinner date with someone else who has the same desire or motivation. So the 2 that we see most often are situational couple violence and intimate terrorism. Situational couple violence is physical violence without a context of control. That is physical violence that does not exist within a general pattern of controlling behavior. And this seems to refer to the domestic violence that's described in those national family conflict studies, those studies that use the conflict tactics scale. So within situational couple violence, generally speaking, we have an equal balance of power within the couple and little or no desire for control. And our perpetrators tend to be poor communicators. That is, people that just don't know how to manage conflict, how to have disagreements in a healthy or productive kind of a way. And so the couple begins arguing about something, and quickly that argument devolves away from the original issue and toward more personal attacks and even some physically violent attacks. And our perpetrators can be men or women. This is the kind of domestic violence that is gender symmetrical. So the dynamics of situational couple violence include the fact that there are relatively few incidents per couple, and that the violence tends to start at a low level but doesn't tend to escalate in severity or frequency over the course of the relationship. So it starts small and it tends to stay small. Now, there's a giant exception. If there's a firearm in the home, then we have a greater likelihood for injury or perhaps even death in this dynamic. But typically, we're not going to see high levels of injury with this. As I mentioned before, it is gender symmetrical. This is also the type of domestic violence that is often witnessed because it is not part of a systematic effort or grand design to get and keep control. This is the kind of domestic violence that can occur anywhere, an argument that erupts in a restaurant or a bar or outside in a parking lot or at a party, and so it tends to be witnessed more frequently. And we see limited forms of abuse in this dynamic. We see physical abuse, punching, slapping, kicking, maybe some destruction of property, and we see emotional abuse, typically restricted to verbal abuse, to name-calling, and perhaps some threats of violence. Situational couple violence is the type of domestic violence that is often more likely to come to the attention of outsiders. Now, part of this has to do with the fact that it is frequently witnessed, and so those third-party bystanders may call 911 themselves. But it also has to do with the equal balance of power in the relationship. The person who is being hurt at the time. And again, in situational couple violence, we might see one person being victimized one time and another person in the relationship being hurt another time. But in this dynamic, the person who is being hurt has enough power in the relationship to get outside help without fear of reprisal from the abuser. So the victim can call 911, can go to a health professional, can get assistance, and not be fearful that doing that will make things worse. Although we can see situational couple violence among all kinds of couples, we tend to see it more among people who have less education and less resources. In contrast to situational couple violence, episodic violence, intimate terrorism is physical violence plus a broad range of power and control tactics that are designed to get and keep control over the victim. With an intimate terrorism dynamic, we tend to see an unequal balance of power. The power is held by the abusive person, and that person has a strong desire to exert control over the victim. And physical abuse is just one element of control. And the abuse that we see is more chronic and more severe over the course of the relationship. Many of the dynamics that we see within intimate terrorism are the flip side of the coin of what we saw with situational couple violence. So we see more frequent incidents of violence per couple, and the physical abuse will escalate in severity and frequency over the course of the relationship. Now, we used to say that physical abuse would escalate until somebody left or somebody died. But that's not quite accurate. It is more accurate to say that in an intimate terrorist dynamic, the physical abuse will escalate in severity and frequency until the abuser believes that he has control. And then we might see that physical abuse actually level off or even taper off or disappear completely. I'll give you an example of this. I worked many years ago with a couple, upper middle class couple. The man had a office in the town where they worked and also a home office. And the marriage was becoming increasingly violent. And on one occasion, he just beat the stew out of her. And I can't even recall what the supposed reason was, but he did a number on her. He had beaten her terribly around the face. She had red marks and swelling that were going to be black eyes and bruises. He had ripped out chunks of her hair. He had put his hands around her throat and attempted to strangle her. He had torn her clothing and clawed at her chest and her breasts. And she was down in just a pile on the floor, cowering and crying. And while she was in that state, he went and got his camera and he took a picture of her. And this was before the days of digital. And so he took the film to one of those Kodak kiosks, that used to be in the front of strip malls. And he got the picture developed and he had it enlarged and he put it in a very elegant, expensive frame. And he put it on his desk in his office at home. And it turned out that that was the last time that he beat her. Because every time after that, he would tell her to go to the study if she did something that he didn't like. Is that really what you're going to wear tonight? Why don't you go into the study and think of something more appropriate? Who told you I wanted pot roast for dinner? Take a cookbook, go sit in the study, and figure out something that I actually want to eat. I'm not so sure you should go see your friends tomorrow for lunch. Why don't you call them and cancel from the phone in my study? Now, if you asked her 6 months, a year, 3 years later, was she being physically abused? Well, the answer is no. She would go into the study. She would rethink the dress. She would come up with a new dinner. She would cancel the date with friends. She would avoid further abuse by complying with him. But if she were to stop complying with him, if she were to take her children and leave, if she were to file for divorce, she would be in serious, serious danger. So, 2 things about this phenomenon of physical abuse escalating in severity and frequency until the abuser believes he has control. The first thing is we don't want to put time limits on our screening or our questions about physical abuse. We don't want to say, in the last 6 months or in the last year, have you experienced X, Y, or Z? Nor do we want to simply focus on physical abuse in our screening, because that can miss the elements of control that are present in intimate terrorism. And the second thing is we never want to confuse the absence of injury with safety. I can look at 2 women. One has a black eye and a busted lip and her arm in a sling, and the other doesn't have a mark on her, and I can't tell which one is in greater danger. Because the black eye and the busted lip and the arm in the sling could have been an argument in a situational couple violence dynamic. And yes, she is injured, and yes, she's the victim of a crime, but she is not at serious risk if she chooses to go through the criminal justice process. She's not at serious risk if she attempts to leave that relationship, because it is a situational couple violence dynamic. Whereas the woman without a mark on her could be like the woman married to the guy with the picture frame in the study. Someone who is being severely controlled and abused, but is avoiding physical injury by complying with the batterer. Intimate terrorism is overwhelmingly committed by men against their female partners. It is also less likely to have witnesses because it is part of a systematic effort. The perpetrators are very much in control of when and where they engage in the violence. And so he can be completely charming to outsiders, to family and friends and coworkers and so forth. And only behind closed doors with the victim will he demonstrate his scary, intimidating, threatening, evil side. We also have greater forms of abuse, greater array and variety of abusive tactics within intimate terrorism than we do with situational couple violence. And so, in addition to physical abuse, we'll see emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and coercive control as well. With emotional abuse, we don't simply see the verbal attacks that we see in situational couple violence, but we also see put-downs, humiliation, minimizing the victim's feelings, denying her experience. You're not hurt, get up. We see constant efforts to sabotage her self-esteem and to keep her in line with threats to do harm to the victim, threats to do harm to the children, threats to do harm to parents or other loved ones, even harming the pets or threatening to harm the pets. So whatever it is that will put the victim in fear, the abuser may threaten her with it. So we had a woman who we were very worried about at Project Safe. She came in and out of our emergency shelter multiple times, but she always went back to her abuser. And the reason was that she had an invalid mother here in town, and this was a low-income family. They couldn't afford nursing home care, really. Her mother had her own home, and the woman's abuser was one of her mom's caregivers. And he was very good and charming to her mother and completely trusted by this woman. And that was the leverage he used. He said, I can kill your mother in an instant, and no one can stop me. And she used to say, you, with a sweeping hand gesture, meaning not only Project Safe, but police or prosecutors, you can't guarantee that he can't get to my mother. And then she would sigh and go on back home. So we have these very powerful threats of violence, threats to do harm. The other forms of abuse, sexual abuse and coercive control, are things that we don't even see in a situational couple violence dynamic. So sexual abuse can be rape or other forms of forced sexual encounters, making the victim look at pornography, making the victim prostitute herself, bringing home people for the victim to have sex with. And then coercive control, which was a phrase coined by Evan Stark, refers to preventing the victim from doing things that she has a right to do, or forcing the victim to do things that she has a right to refuse. So examples of coercive control include not allowing someone to leave the house, not allowing someone to eat or sleep or bathe or work with men or work at night, or so on and so forth. It is frightening just how creative some of these intimate terrorists can get with coercive control. Now, coercive control is never the first or only form of abuse in an intimate terrorism dynamic, because it simply doesn't work. If someone on the first or second or third date says, I don't want you to wear red anymore, only whores wear red, someone's apt to respond with something like, I love red. Red's my signature color. I'm a big Bulldog fan. I'm not going to stop wearing red and black, and be offended by that, and certainly not go along with the abuser's directive. You have to have an or else. You have to have an experience with physical abuse, an experience with sexual abuse, a really good threat holding over the victim's head in order for coercive control to work. And so then once you have that, the victim then complies with the abuser in order to avoid that threat. I can remember working with a man in prison who didn't want his live-in girlfriend to leave the house ever. And he'd say, I don't want you to leave the house while I'm gone. He'd be at work all day, but he still wanted her home all day. And initially, she thought, well, this is stupid. And she had a car, she had gas in the tank, she had keys in the car, and she would leave and simply come back home before he would get home from work. But he always seemed to know that she had left. And he would rage at her. He would pace in front of her, make her sit on the couch and pace back and forth and yell at her and lecture her. Sometimes he would beat her. He'd say, I don't want you to leave this house, ever. And so she'd try leaving earlier in the day, maybe just slipping out at lunch or something, and getting back so many hours before he came home. And she'd think, surely he wouldn't know. And yet he always seemed to know. And he'd say, you can't do anything without my knowing about it. And she began to believe that he had surveillance equipment and spies. And pretty soon over time, she stopped leaving the house. Even though she had an 8-hour window every day when she could have left, even though she had that car sitting there in the driveway, she was afraid to leave the house because he always seemed to know, and he would be so angry and yell at her and beat her and berate her. He didn't have spies. He didn't have surveillance equipment. He had a magic marker in the glove box of his car, and they had a gravel driveway. And he'd go out in the morning and he'd pick up a piece of gravel and he would mark it with his marker, and he would place it just so underneath the back tire of her car. And then when he got home, he would check. And if the gravel with the mark was still pristinely there behind the tire of her car, he would know that she had stayed home. And if it was packed down into the bed of the driveway, he would know that she had left the house. Now, over time, her friends became worried about her, of course. They'd call on the phone and they'd say, "You've got to leave this guy. You've got to get away." And eventually she did. She went to stay with one of her friends, and he found her there and killed her. And as sad as that was, it was just as predictable, because anybody who is that controlling is not going to allow someone to leave the relationship, is not going to be defied without severe consequence. Another feature of intimate terrorism is isolation. We see isolation in many forms in this dynamic. We see isolation through taking advantage of benign events. So the abuser has a job transfer, has an opportunity to move, and then once that move occurs, he makes it difficult for the victim to stay in touch with family and friends. We can't afford a fancy cell phone plan. We can't afford to take time off to go back and visit. We can have isolation through attrition. Basically, he makes it so uncomfortable around family and friends that they begin to stop coming by, that they begin to stop calling and being so much a part of the victim's life, because they simply find it so unpleasant and disagreeable. We can have isolation through flattery, particularly with young women and girls, with teens and folks in their early 20s. Your friends are holding you back. They don't have it going on like you do. They're not as smart as you. You need to spend your time with me and with my friends and not with them. We can have isolation through whirlwind romance. I love you. I want to spend all our time together. Let's go away this weekend. Let's go away next week. And the same kind of thing, though, where the abuser is inserting himself in all aspects of her life, separating the victim from her network of support. We can have isolation through religion. Your friends and family are not on the path to righteousness. Your church is not the right way. You need to worship at home with me, or you need to come with me to my church. And again, same result of separating from family and friends. And that isolation is not only bad in and of itself, but it has an enhancing effect on the other forms of abuse. So because the victim then does not have her allies and her family and her friends to turn to say, "Can you believe what he called me? Can you believe what he said?" and doesn't have anyone responding, going, "That's crazy, that's wrong, he shouldn't treat you like that." Because the victim doesn't have that, then she begins to take on more and more of what the batterer is telling her, take on more and more of that emotional abuse. Another feature of intimate terrorism is jealousy, extreme jealousy. Not every person who is jealous is an intimate terrorist, of course, but all intimate terrorists are jealous of their victims. As you might expect, intimate terrorism has a much different impact on the victim than situational couple violence does. We see much higher rates of depression and anxiety among victims of intimate terrorism. We see that they are less able to retain employment, and that can be for a number of reasons. Sometimes the intimate terrorist is sabotaging the victim's ability to work. He's showing up or calling or texting, emailing 20 times a day. Sometimes he is forbidding her to work. Sometimes she may willingly stop work in order to take care of him in an effort to devote herself more to him and hopefully stop the abusive behavior in that way. I've already mentioned the isolation from social support. And as a result of that, we see a focus on immediate safety needs, and we see that the intermittency of the violence leads to a belief that things will change, that things will get better. And this is most commonly expressed in the form of cycle of violence. The cycle of violence was developed by psychologist Lenore Walker, and she describes 3 distinct phases. The first is a tension-building phase where the victim can see a look in his eyes, and this is often described by victims as feeling as though they're walking on eggshells, just knowing that something is about to happen. And then we have the battering event or an explosive incident, the act of physical abuse or sexual abuse. And then after that, in the cycle of violence, we have the honeymoon or loving contrition phase. And this is when the batterer says that he'll never do it again, that he is sorry, he will stop drinking, he will begin going to church, he will get a job or do whatever it takes to try to get back into the victim's good graces. And so many people experience intimate terrorism in this sort of cycle of violence with physical abuse, but there are many who do not. There are many people who say they don't see it coming, that they don't experience this tension-building phase, and there are plenty of people who say that they don't experience a honeymoon afterward. It's probably more accurate to say that after an episode of physical or sexual violence, there is a coercion phase. And that coercion could be positive. It could be the honeymoon and the hearts and the flowers and the promises to change. Or it could be negative. It could be threats to take the children, threats to get the biggest, baddest divorce lawyer in town, threats to expose something about her, or threats to harm her or her loved ones. Because of the significant effect that intimate terrorism has on people who experience it, we as outsiders often witness behavior that we find incredibly frustrating and maybe even not reasonable based on our perception as outsiders, as people who are not experiencing this. One of the frustrating things that we may witness or experience is something that I refer to as taking antibiotics, and it's based on my own habit of the few times when I become ill enough where I need to take antibiotics. I begin to take them, and pretty soon afterward I start to feel so good that I feel like I don't need to take that medicine anymore. And because I don't like to take medicine, then very often I will stop, even though there is always a warning on the label that says that you're supposed to take all of it as prescribed. And so we see this antibiotic phenomenon sometimes among victims of intimate terrorism, where they will take steps to seek safety. And then once the threat seems to be over, they feel that those steps are no longer necessary. And so as judges, you may see this if you ever take temporary protective orders, for example, that someone may come before you seeking a protective order, and then some months later may decide that they want that order dismissed because he's not bothering her anymore, and they don't feel like it is necessary. The same thing can be true with leaving the relationship, moving into a shelter, or perhaps ending contact with the batterer. And then the violence seems to end, and the victim feels like, well, I've done what I need to do, and it's better now, and so I no longer have cause to fear. Another behavior that we see is something that I call preparing for a storm. I mentioned earlier that victims of intimate terrorism tend to focus on immediate safety needs, and that's what we see here. When I was a child in Louisville, Kentucky, I can remember a series of tornadoes that just ravaged the city. It killed many people, including a neighbor of ours who was running from her car into the house. I remember how quickly it came on and what it felt like to be scooped up into my mother's arms and carried down into the basement just as the storm hit. I don't know if you've ever been in the path of a tornado or maybe a hurricane, but when you're in the path of a storm, you are not thinking about the long term. You're not thinking about what to do in a month or a year or 5 years. You're thinking about, what do I do now to keep myself safe? A victim in an intimate terrorism dynamic is standing in the path of a storm. And she is often thinking, what do I do right now to keep me and my children safe? And so when she is being beaten, when she is being hurt by the batterer, she may call 911 in order to stop the attack now. But by the time law enforcement arrives, she might be changing her story out of fear that he will retaliate. She might not do that. He might be arrested and taken to jail, but perhaps she is going to the jail with checkbook in hand to post his bond. She's thinking again about that retaliation, or perhaps she's thinking about who will pay the mortgage or who will pay the rent. Or maybe she's heard that threat, the very common threat among batterers, that DFACS will come and take her children away if he's arrested. This phenomenon, this preparing for the storm phenomenon, can lead people to recant or refuse to cooperate with prosecution, refuse to participate in the trial. So we see this behavior that to us as outsiders is incredibly frustrating. We think, why won't you do this? Why won't you participate with us? Why won't you stick to your decision? Because to us it looks like going back and forth. We need to remember that storm coming. We need to remember she's standing in the path and she is making decisions in order to enhance her immediate safety, her children or her family's immediate safety. And so our job is to try to improve her chances of safety, to try to redirect that storm, to try to minimize its impact so that she can take a longer view of her life and her choices. I've been trying to impress upon you the importance of context in domestic violence, the importance of the context of the criminal act of domestic violence that you may see before you as judges, that the crime occurs as part of a dynamic, of systemic or battering or intimate terrorism behavior, or as part of a dynamic of episodic or situational couple violence without much control. And one of the newer ways that we have to understand the context of domestic violence is to analyze lethality factors. Now, lethality factors are events or circumstances that have shown to indicate that a victim might be at higher risk for serious violence and or death. So these factors have been determined through studies at the national level of domestic violence homicides. Now, lethality factor analysis is not an exact science. It's a little more like predicting the weather or predicting the stock market. And so low scores do not equal safety. And there are people with higher lethality factor scores that are still living and walking among us. And so we have to recognize that this isn't foolproof. We also have to have access to good information. So we need to have access to the victim in a safe or confidential environment. This is not something where we can ask a series of questions of a victim in open court. We have to have good information on the police report, and this can be a place where the court can learn of lethality factors. If the court will ask that police officers take care to note them on their incident or arrest reports, we have to have access to good information. But the benefits of doing lethality factor analysis are quite profound. They help us understand what is important in the domestic violence. They help us understand the context or the landscape that the crime is occurring. And because of that, they can help us improve our safety planning with people who are experiencing domestic violence. They can help us make that person more aware of what is significant and what is going on. And therefore, victims can assess their own situation and help to improve their own safety. And of course, they can help law enforcement and courts more effectively assess situations and make choices regarding things like bond conditions or temporary protective orders and so forth. They can help make those choices easier and more informed. Now, I have seen lethality assessments that have as few as 5 factors on them, and I have seen lethality assessments that have as many as 45 factors on them. I like a hit parade of 14, and that's what I've provided here today. And I like to organize them into 3 categories: quantitative and environmental and qualitative. And so the quantitative lethality factors have to do with the type or severity of domestic violence. And so on this list we have attempted strangulation and sexual assault, an increase in violent attacks, threats to kill, and access to firearms. Attempted strangulation is so significant that many states now have begun to adopt new statutes defining a crime of strangulation, taking it out of aggravated assault or aggravated battery type things and putting it on its own. And this is mainly fueled by concern over domestic violence strangulation. An increase in violent attacks, especially if it's occurring within the last few weeks or a month prior to whatever it is that you are seeing the victim for. And threats to kill are not just words. They are statistically very significant. And the more specific the threat, the more seriously we should take it. So if it sounds like the perpetrator has been thinking about it, has a plan for it, or perhaps has been fantasizing about it, this needs to be something that we take very seriously. And then access to firearms. And not only is this significant in the obvious way, in the state of Georgia, the overwhelming majority of domestic violence homicides occur due to firearms, but also other states have found that when a domestic violence abuser is known to have a firearm, then neighbors and family and friends are less likely to want to get involved and intervene on behalf of the victim because they're afraid. And so the impact of the firearm is really twofold. And certainly that latter issue, that people are less likely to help the victim. She has fewer sources of support if the batterer has a firearm, is one that we need to be aware of, and try to direct victims then to more formal sources of support, such as shelters or domestic violence centers, to try to get more help. The second kind of lethality factors are environmental, and these have to do with the context or the landscape that the relationship is occurring in. So we have things like unemployment on the part of the perpetrator, substance abuse on the part of the perpetrator, access to the victim, and pregnancy on the part of the victim. And then the third category of lethality factors are what we call qualitative, and this has to do with the power and control that's in the relationship. So these factors are controlling or jealous behavior, the victim's efforts to leave or sever the relationship, and this includes not only divorce or separation, but breaking up, moving out, moving on, getting a new boyfriend, filing for a temporary protective order, that sort of thing. Depression or thoughts of suicide on the part of the batterer. The victim's own terror is significant. And then also harassment or stalking type behavior, whether that's occurring while the relationship is going on or after the relationship is over. You know, the majority of domestic violence homicides, about 75%, occur after the relationship has ended. So here's an example of how lethality factor analysis can change the way we perceive a situation. In this example, we've got a husband and wife, and the police are called for a physical assault and a suicide threat. And the wife describes that he tried to break her neck. That's a quote. He attempted to strangle her in bed, and she was able to get away. And then he started trying to create an explosion by putting household products, cleaning products and the like, into the microwave, and then threatened suicide. And so a traditional view of this situation would focus on the fact that there were no prior domestic violence police reports. There were no visible injuries to the victim. His attempt to strangle her did not leave any marks on her throat that she could show to law enforcement. There were no weapons involved, and the perpetrator had no criminal history. And so taken all together, you might think that this was just a simple battery, and in fact that's what the police report was written for. You might think that this was not a terribly serious event. But if we apply lethality factor analysis, not only to the police report, but if we had access to speak to the victim, we would learn some additional things. If we applied lethality factor analysis to this, we would note, of course, the attempted strangulation. We would note the threat of suicide. We would note the access to the victim. Of course, they're living together. And we would learn from talking to the victim that he was currently unemployed. And we would find out from her that he had a firearm. We'd learn that he did abuse alcohol. And we'd learn that in addition to threatening to kill himself, he had also threatened to kill her. And so if we add all that up, we would find 8 lethality factors, which is the average number of factors present in a victim who is killed by a domestic violence perpetrator. And so it changes our perception of the situation. It makes us cognizant of the danger, and it might lead us to take different steps to try to increase this victim's safety, to try to increase accountability for this batterer. And in fact, some time after this particular event, the husband did in fact wind up killing his wife. And so when we apply lethality factor analysis to a seemingly minor crime, Hopefully it will lead us to take that more seriously, and to try to set up measures so that the victim can access safety, and to set up measures that might limit the perpetrator's access to the victim, set up measures that help us monitor what is going on. Whether we're dealing with intimate terrorism or situational couple violence, we need to remember that while some people suffer alone, many people do reach out and report what is happening, and also reach out for help from social services and others. And so as judges, your encounters with victims of domestic violence aren't occurring in a vacuum. And many of those victims that come before you are experiencing barriers that make it difficult to deal with the situation or to get out of the situation. And those barriers can be things that we might think of like lack of transportation or lack of income. But the barriers can also be the complexity of the system that we have designed to help people who are experiencing domestic violence. And so the following slides illustrate what happens to victims of domestic violence when they encounter law enforcement or child protection or civil and criminal justice systems in Athens, Clarke County. And although they're written specifically for Athens, Clarke, I think you'll find that they're fairly universal among all counties in Georgia. And so here we have our example victim and her two children. And here we have the flow of events following domestic violence arrest report. And so we have proceeding left from the victim a 911 call, and then the officer responds, and either there's no arrest and an incident report, or there is an arrest. And moving up along the left, we see going to jail, and then the bond hearing, and then moving along the right at the top, arraignment, trial or plea, sentencing, monitoring or probation, and FFIP. And here's the flow of events. We're dealing with child protection services. So if the police have been called and there are children in the home, then they'll make a referral to the Department of Family and Children Services, and there will be a screening, CPS intake, and that case might be screened out completely. It might be diverted, which often happens if the victim is working with an organization like Project Safe, or perhaps there'll be a CPS case that's opened. And then if law enforcement hasn't been involved prior to this point, there may be law enforcement involvement at this juncture. Then moving up the right-hand side, we see an investigation and safety and service plan. And moving up along the top, the case management, the various assessments that may occur, and then the outcome, whether the case is closed or whether it moves on to foster care, long-term foster care or adoption, or perhaps reunification. So this map illustrates housing, and particularly in public housing, when there is a zero tolerance for criminal activity, we can have a situation where if there's domestic violence occurring on the property, the victim winds up being evicted from her home along with the perpetrator. And so here we have the TPO process in our community that most frequently begins with a call to our hotline or to the Family Violence Clinic at the University of Georgia. And then the victim files the temporary protective order. We have the ex parte hearing. Right? And then following from that, the service to the respondent, the second or 30-day hearing, and then either denial of the TPO or granting of the TPO, and then the relief following that. And this map illustrates the divorce and custody process, beginning with the filing and the left-hand side, and then the hearing, custody, possible DFACS involvement if we haven't had it yet, and then our final hearing, child support, custody awarded, and so on. And so when we put everything together, here's what it looks like. And conceivably, all of this could arise out of one incident of domestic violence. Now, I am very familiar with all of these systems, and yet when I look at this laid out in this fashion, I'm overwhelmed by it. So I can only imagine what someone with less familiarity, less experience with the system might think. So for every step in that maze max, for every box, there is a meeting or a hearing, an appointment, something that requires a response from the victim, something that was probably not scheduled with her convenience in mind, something where she needs to either bring the children to them or make sure to have childcare for the children, something where she needs to have transportation, the flexibility to get off work. And all of this, as I said before, is an overwhelming process for most victims of domestic violence. And so finally, in trying to really understand domestic violence, context matters. We have to understand the context of the criminal act. What is the power and control at issue in the relationship? If there is no context of control, of course, the criminal act is still a crime, but it is less dangerous for the victim, less damaging to the victim, and we need to realize that. If that criminal act is occurring within a context of power and control, then we have a very high potential for danger, a very high potential for damage to the victim. And we need to tailor our responses, our intervention to the perpetrator and our responses to the victim and family differently than we might in those cases where the criminal act is occurring without that context of power and control. And then we also need to understand and be aware of the context of the community response to domestic violence. Are we sending a victim through a maze of services that, of course, are designed to respond and help, but wind up being disjointed and difficult to navigate? Or are we taking steps to coordinate? Are we taking steps to communicate and collaborate through task forces and interagency protocols in order to harness our efforts all to improve the safety of people in our community who are experiencing domestic violence?